to receive this recognition twice. Today marks the launch of the Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies. Mr. Desai's generous contribution will go a long way in positioning IIT Bombay as a leader in the nascent field of policy studies in India. I also extend a very warm welcome to our distinguished speakers for the evening. Professor Kaushik Basu, Professor of Economics and Karl Marx Professor of International Studies at the Department of Economics and S.C. Johnson Graduate School of Management, Cornell University, Ithaca, and New York, and Dr. Naushad Forbes, co-chairman of Forbes Marshall, India's leading steam engineering and control instrumentation company, as well as our discussant for the evening, the esteemed Ms. Yamini Iyer, President and Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research. Given the presence of such eminent personalities amongst us today, I am certain today's event is going to be insightful and enjoyable. Once again, a very warm welcome to everybody. I would now like to invite the Deputy Director, Academic and Infrastructural Affairs, and Acting Director for today, Professor Sudarshan, to deliver the welcome address.
I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you, those who are present physically here today, it's a small number, and all those who are here virtually today. It's a real privilege to have all of you here. We have really eminent people, starting, of course, with Mr. Ashank Desai, who has made today's event possible through his very generous contributions. I actually had a speech for this welcome. It turns out the previous speaker has already given my speech, so I have to make up something new and hopefully more interesting. So let me just tell you a few words about Mr. Ashank Desai, which I know personally. Mr. Desai is truly a friend of IIT. He's not just an alumnus of IIT. He continues to be with us. He has been with us continuously over many years, and he has been helping us in many different capacities, such as he's, the Sign Incubator. He's currently Vice Chairman, but he has been associated with it for many years. He's also been a member of our Senate, and he is a very regular visitor to IIT. He lives just outside and comes for morning walks where I see him periodically. So it's a real pleasure to have somebody who's so closely associated take the next step and help start this new center for policy studies. Now, technology has had a huge impact on the world today. As all of you know, the impact can be either positive or negative. And policies help drive what actually happens. And it is really important that a Center for Policy Studies be embedded in a technology institution like India to cover those aspects of policies which are related to technology. So I'm very sure that this is the right thing at the right place, and it is going to have a very positive influence going forward into the future. And while we already have this center which has been in place for a few years, it needs a push. It needs support, including infrastructure and support in terms of getting more people involved and to take it to the next level and have the impact which it will have with this support. I'd also like to welcome the participants today. Dr. Kaushik Basu, who has already been introduced, who really needs no introduction. When I read his title, I saw that he is the Karl Marx Professor at Cornell. Now, those of you who think of Karl Marx, please note that it is a Karl with a C and a Marx with a KS. So it's not what you think it is. So it's a real pleasure to have a distinguished person like Kaushik Basu, who has visited us physically also in the past. We have close relations. And he is somebody that all of us admire very greatly. It's also a pleasure to have Mr. Naushad Forbes, Chairman of Forbes Marshall, who is an eminent industrialist and who has already been introduced. And this is a very excellent company which has contributed a great deal to our economy. And finally, our discussant for the day, Ms. Yamini I'm sorry. Yamini Iyer, right? I hope I didn't mess up the name. I'm sorry. Yeah, Yamini Iyer, who is Chief Executive of the Center for Policy Research in Delhi and very well known in this area. We look forward to the interactions which we are going to have today. Thank you all for coming. And a warm welcome to this event.
Thank you, Professor Sudarshan. I now invite Professor Shishir K. Jha, Professor and Head of Department, Center for Policy Studies, CPS, IIT Bombay, to address the gathering.
Good evening to one and all here. As the head of the Center for Policy Studies, I would like at the very outset, on behalf of all our staff, students, and faculty, to profusely thank Mr. Ashank Desai for his very generous donation made to IIT Bombay and the Center for Policy Studies in particular. I would like to take this very magnanimous gesture by a very successful alumnus of IIT Bombay as indeed a ringing endorsement of the potentially bright future for policy studies at IIT Bombay. We do expect the Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies, that we now would call ADCPS, to live up to the confidence that is being bestowed on it. I would like to take this important occasion to also graciously thank the Institute and the Director for providing the necessary intellectual and academic freedom for allowing a policy center to organically grow and flourish. The center clearly cherishes and deeply appreciates the institutional milieu of a diverse and vibrant academic body. I would like to particularly acknowledge our guest speakers, Dr. Naushad Forbes, Professor Kaushik Basu, the discussant, Ms. Yamini Iyer, the Deputy Director, Professor Sudarshan, Dean ACR, Professor Suhas Joshi, other dignitaries, several colleagues and students, and many well-wishers. The policy process, like life itself, is indeed rather fragile. This fragility and vulnerability emanates from constantly thwarted expectations, the unyielding gap, as it were, between our faith in the state and its unproven record of delivering. The history of policy making is littered, one may say, with many more policy failures than successes. Whether it is access to low-cost housing, good primary education, or nourishing healthcare, or in preventing perhaps rampant malnutrition, we are constantly faced with severe challenges. The pandemic, one may say, has very acutely brought this frailty closer home. How do we make sense of this stubborn reality? It may be appropriate during the COVID times to quote from a fascinating essay authored by Sally Davies, the title of which is End Times for Humanity. Ms. Davies puts her finger very close to our contemporary problem when she states that if today humanity has started to express a sense of unprecedented fragility, this is not because a life of precarious, exposed, and vulnerable existence has suddenly and accidentally interrupted a history of stability. Rather, it reveals, according to her, that the thing itself called humanity is better seen as a hiatus, an interlude, and an intensification of an essential and transcendental fragility. In other words, our normal human everyday condition for the vast majority of people has always remained rather fragile. Stability is actually the exception. For students of the policy process, such as us, the million-dollar question is, why do we continue to feel fragile in a world that is every day becoming more technologically powerful? One way to think through this relation between our fragility on the one hand and technological capability on the other is to perhaps flip the question around. In other words, does our continuing uncertainty in a world that is facing the terror of microbes and fundamentalists alike, that is despairing at the resurgence of poverty and hate crimes, does such a world make us yearn for a kind of immediate certainty in our solutions, particularly with respect to our policy solutions. More to the point, Bertrand Russell had once famously said that what men crave is not knowledge, but certainty. But faced with these continuing crises and a longing for certain answers, can the process of public policy making step into the breach, as it were? Can the process be more enduring and patient? I would like to submit that we may need to more humanly embrace our state of brittleness, our precariousness, or our vulnerability, and eschew perhaps the hasty claims to certainty. Policymakers need to be very carefully and humbly learn from their past mistakes. Given the many uncertainties surrounding the policy space, the Center for Policy Studies at IIT Bombay began its journey from 2016 in real earnest, with several core and associate faculty, postdoctoral fellows, with over 50 doctoral students distributed over 5 batches, and around 30 students distributed over 2 master's batch. There is a palpable sense of dynamism and a joie de vivre coursing through the center. The center, under Professor Satish Agnihotri as its first head, and other founding members, including Professor N.C. Narayanan, Professor K. Narayanan, Professor Rangan Banerjee, Professor Viren Sethi, among others, decided that it must pursue 2 principal tasks, among others. A, to orient itself to a broader spectrum of policy research, and B, to engage in evidence-based policy making. Professor Parthasarathi and Professor Subodh Wagle joined in these efforts subsequently. I'm glad to state that we are progressing well towards fulfilling our early goals. We have clearly specified, after considerable internal deliberation, 5 research areas in the policy space that we are keenly pursuing, namely digital society, structural inequalities, markets and governance processes, environment, energy and natural resources, and last and not the least, technology and society. With the support of the Ashank Desai Fund, we are very significantly embarked on creating several white papers on various topics. I would like to take the remaining moments to briefly highlight some of the interesting research projects that CPS is currently engaged on. An international collaborative project with members from IIT Bombay, IIT Delhi, and the University of Queensland, Australia, funded by MHRD, has been engaging on the very topical area of digital platforms, its economics and infrastructure, a topic clearly of much interest among our faculty and students. CPS has also been paying particular interest towards how the digital context is being both used and often abused to serve political and policy interests. The issue of quote-unquote fake content in its many avatars, something that has been weaponized by easily available digital devices and software, is an area that we expect to see interesting findings, including a few white papers. Given the growing prevalence and popularity of artificial intelligence as a panacea of sorts, CPS is keenly positioning itself to develop a critical perspective. The presumptions around using AI in contexts as diverse as health, finance, facial recognition require meticulous deliberation. This is a potentially rich and fruitful area for IIT to engage on, given that we have excellent faculty both in the policy space as well as those with technological background. Within the broad area of structural inequalities, CPS faculty are closely examining issues related to aging, labor, health, and nutrition, among others. One of our deep and abiding concerns is to more carefully understand and provide adequate policy response towards how structural inequalities that manifest itself across generations negatively affects our access to public goods. As a policy governance process, the importance of last-mile delivery of public goods is another area of keen research interest among our faculty and students. And under the aegis of environmental services, CPS has taken initiatives to deepen its engagement with issues related to local governance. In collaboration with the Kerala Institute of Local Administration, a nationally leading organization for research and capacity building for local self-governance, a town with 2 adjacent panchayats were chosen for close engagement. These led to the development of interventions such as the deploying of improved sanitation infrastructure in slums and policy assistance to local governments with a master plan for integrated sanitation, both solid, liquid, and septage management that was all adopted. The large and crucial aim of this project is to develop the Canal P initiative into a field lab for local governance studies for students, academics, and practitioners in the country and abroad. So looking towards the future, the center will be very keen to at least double its faculty size, further strengthen its 5 research areas through collaboration with institutions and organizations worldwide. In particular, with a larger faculty size, we would like to explore the possibility of offering a dual BTech MPP degree. The Masters in Public Policy program appears to have generated considerable interest among sections of the IIT Bombay's undergraduate population. We expect to be creating within the next few years at least a dozen white papers jointly authored by professional policy experts and CPS faculty. So ADCPS will indeed find itself in a very unique position. A flourishing policy center within IIT Bombay amidst and adjacent to humanities, design, management, Sitara, and several interested faculty from engineering departments such as chemical, computer science, electrical, and civil engineering. We expect ADCPS, with your good wishes, to overcome many of the new intellectual challenges that are facing us. With that note, I would like to sincerely thank everyone for their presence today, and now would like to take your leave. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We now move on to our Director Sir's video message.
Mr. Ashank Desai, Professor Kaushik Pasu, Dr. Naushad Probst, Yamini Iyer, other distinguished colleagues, guests, and students. It's a wonderful occasion to be here on a special day when we inaugurate a certain new program that IIT Bombay has started doing it, and that is due to the philanthropy of one of our distinguished alumnus, Mr. Ashank Desai. IIT Bombay started a new center called Center for Policy Studies for the benefit of leveraging the engineering and the management education that IIT Bombay provides with the needs of the society and how we leverage our strength in respect to what the society demands and what are the policies that are to be framed to make sure that the lives of common people improve and they get the benefit of technology. Today, we're happy to say that this particular initiative that IIT Bombay took it a few years ago has seen a big taker, somebody who has put his, put his faith in our effort and come up with the philanthropy to support it. Not only the program, but also in the form of setting up the required infrastructure to house the Center for Policy Studies. Policy studies in India are at a very, very nascent stage, and the Center for Policy Studies at IIT Bombay was started with a vision to create a center of excellence that facilitates evidence-based and evidence-informed and inclusive public policy. Mr. Desai's generous contribution will go a long way in furthering this vision and enabling the center to create an ecosystem that promotes dialogues between academia and other policy stakeholders. Mr. Desai's contribution will facilitate infrastructure building and enable the center to focus on areas of relevance to the times we live in. And the key among them are the digital societies, environmental services, and the societal and the structural inequalities. I am confident that Mr. Desai's donation will play a pivotal role in the development of the relatively new setup of the CPS at IIT Bombay. I thank all of you for joining here this evening to support the cause that IIT Bombay initiated and the corresponding philanthropy that was bestowed on us by Mr. Ashank Desai. So I hope that our effort becomes a successful journey for CPS, and for that we are very thankful to Professor Kaushik Basu, Dr. Naushad Forbes, Yamini Iyer for being here and addressing us today and enlightening us on what are the possible pathways through which we can explore how the CPS can engage with IIT Bombay and the society. So thank you very much, and I hope all of you will enjoy the evening.
This CPS has now been further supported by the generous funding from IIT Bombay's distinguished alumnus, Mr. Ashank Desai. To honor Mr. Desai's contribution to the center, IIT Bombay has named this center as Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies. May I now request Mr. Desai to address the audience.
Good evening to our friends in India, and good day to many of my friends in UK and US and other places who have joined this event. Professor Kaushik Basu, Naushad Forbes, Yamini, Director Subhashish and Deputy Director Sudarshan, and the head Shishir Za, and we also have our previous head Satish Agnihotri, and my dear friend, philosopher guide, Professor Phatak, who has come all the way. I would like to talk less today because I think we have our distinguished speakers there, whom all of you are waiting to speak. But what I will really do is talk my thoughts behind why I wanted to kind of move this center ahead. So I was reflecting on my last 40 years. As many of you know, I come from IT industry, and I was one of those early entrepreneurs where nobody knew what was IT. I jokingly say that my mother never knew what business I was in because I couldn't show her my product and we had to talk in the evening. So she was firmly convinced that I'm in some shady business which has to be only done at night time. Such was the ignorance. But the point, seriously speaking, I am making is we started with that an organization called NASSCOM. I have been lucky to be one of the founders. And all of us, this initial group of people, were really struggling to explain to the government what is this industry about and what do you need. I still remember once in a while we should trouble our friend Professor Phatak to send some note to government explaining, because his voice would have been much more credible, and so on. So there was nothing about that industry which was available for government to decide as a policy. There was a paper from World Bank which was useful, but the point I'm making is we, all of us in NASSCOM, were struggling to convey what kind of industry this is and what kind of policies we need to have. And I still remember that struggle, which went on for a very long time. So policy making, and policy making particularly in the changing technology industries, suddenly struck in my mind as an impact area that one could do something about. Because things are going to be still more complex, as all of you know. The IT particularly, which I live, is going to get more and more complex. There are a whole host of issues on, as all of us know, social media, whole host of issues on Bitcoin, whole of the issues on autonomous driving. I think all of these are really regulatory issues that are going to decide future of these technologies at one level. So as government policies 30 years ago decided also in some way NASSCOM's success, they were our partner. Now, in today's world, in fact, this policy making becomes still more important because now it is not about industry, it is about citizens who are going to get impacted, whether it's an electrical vehicle, whether it is about solar and other technologies. All of these are national issues with an implication. And unless we have intellectual approach at one hand, and at the other end, issue approach based on dialogue with all the stakeholders who have become very sensitive now. They will not accept a policy which is one-sided. So I think this dialogue-based and intellectual insight-based, research-based approach is what we need for policy making. So with that in mind, I felt that if I could do something little in that direction, it would be useful. So that was the first reason why I am here talking about that. Now, why IIT Bombay? That was a little bit easier decision, but it is like this. I thought, and it's known, that in any think tank which is independently run, there are always issues of ideology and various things. So it loses sometimes, not all of them, but many a time loses the credibility because of the inklings or the inclinations. What we need really is a policy, which is policy advice, which is unbiased at one level, which is not biased by any particular stakeholder or any particular vested interest, if I may use the word. And IIT stands obviously tall there as an academic institution. And at the same time, it needs to bring intellectuals from all the disciplines together for policies. It has become very complex. And IIT Bombay, as all of you know, obviously technology-wise is far ahead and rated very well, even at a global level, as all of you know. But apart from that, it also has humanities and even social service kind of departments which are looking at the whole society. So here was an institution which was kind of well suited to be there. I still remember in 2016 when this was founded, there was a big alumni event and we had large policy makers from government landed up there. And all of them were feeling that if IIT kind of institution stands up and talks about policies, talks about what needs to be done, it will be heard by them. It will be heard by the policy makers because it has a standing and it had an unbiased view. So that decision was very clear that IIT Bombay would be much better suited in terms of its impact that we want to have on policy making. So that was my reason number 2. My reason number 3, of course, is very emotional. I was right here 40 years or plus ago receiving my degree. I still remember that day. My association with IIT, of course, continued for a long time. Since now I am involved with many other things that people have talked about. And I strongly feel that whatever I am here is the educational institutes that I studied, and IIT Bombay carries a large role in it. I still remember the computer access that I got, which was my interest in computer, in fact, and so on. So I strongly feel that all of us alumni got a very education at a very low cost, and beyond anything else, we built a network of IITians, which has been a big treasure. So I think all of us need to, as I say, pay back the debt that institute has given us, And I felt that in a small way I could do something, it would be good. So those are my three reasons: importance of policy making in the future, importance of IIT Bombay as an institution of eminence and comprehensiveness and unbiased, uh, and whatever I said about my being alum. So those three reasons, I feel I'm looking forward to get involved in small way with this center, and looking obviously from advice from all of you who are listening to me here, my friends as well as those in audience here physically. This is a time to say thanks to many. I think starting of course from Suhas, who is the Dean ACR and his team, including Dipti and others, and Ravi, heading DRF, and his team members like Kalyani, Nidhi, and others. They have spent a lot of time to make this happen as we speak today. Thanks to all of them. Thanks to, of course, my family members who are here. My wife Padma is here, my son Chinmay, and my mother would have been very happy to be here. So their support has brought me up to this and think about doing something like this. So I thank all of them too. And I'm really looking forward to this institution, that is the ADCPS, becoming most respected policy center, not only in India, but respected globally in terms of the kind of work it does, and it is going to do over next many, many years that we say. So with that great hope, a great dream, and great ambition, I would like to thank and say end of my speech. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. I request you to remain on the stage while I invite all the dignitaries to assist Mr. Desai for the unveiling of the logo. Thank you, everybody. Can we now please play the launch video?
I'm delighted to be with you this evening. And just as Ashank said earlier today, that he had three reasons for funding the Center for Policy Studies, I have three reasons why I'm so delighted. I'm delighted because this center and this program is being held at IIT Bombay. I have many great friends at IIT Bombay from the past and the present. People like Suhas Sukatme, Ashok Mishra, Devang Kakkar, Rangan Banerjee, Professor Pathak, who's in the audience, and many others. IIT Bombay is an institute that I have the greatest regard and respect for. Second, the subject of the center, policy studies or public policy, This is a great need in our country. I'll come back to this in a minute. And third, Ashank Desai. Ashank is one of our great entrepreneurs. He has not only built a great company, but he is amongst our most public spirited of entrepreneurs. So first of all, why I'd like to talk of three things. First, why a Center for Policy Studies and why is public policy important? In our country, too much of policy reform happens as a result of what the great and the good think. Some strong leader somewhere makes a speech somewhere on a subject, and that becomes policy. And whether that policy is policy for urban planning, or whether it's energy policy, or whether it's mobility policy, or even innovation policy, it tends to flow from the great and the good think and announce. Policy should instead be, as we've heard today, an in-depth subject. It should require good theoretical background and understanding. It should require dialogue so that one builds a sense of what is right to do. And it requires communication and outreach. Get those ideas out to the wider public so they understand what's being done and why it's being done. When I thought about how policy reform happens in our country, you'll hear more about this, I think, from my friend Kaushik Basu, who's actually lived this, experienced this, done this. When you ask the question of how does policy reform happen in our country, we've actually been quite good at making many good things happen. But I think it requires three stars to line up. And when those stars line up, they line up somewhat randomly, but when they line up, the reform happens. And those three stars are roughly, I think, as follows. You need the right minister in place, someone who's knowledgeable and keen to perform. Second, you need the right department secretary to coincide with that right minister, someone who's committed and competent in the field. And third, you need the right preparation in place. And the right preparation is detailed reform proposals, detailed policy proposals that have been worked out so that the department can then go ahead and implement it. When those three stars line up, I think then policy reform happens. And I think too often things don't happen because when you have the right minister combining with the right secretary, we're not prepared. We don't have the right things in place. And that's something that this center should directly address, and every public policy professional around the country and interested in doing work in India should help us address. So the second point is what's good public policy? Good public policy, as I mentioned earlier, has to bring together solid theoretical understanding with a good academic work in the subject with a policy perspective. And this is where I think this center can really play a very valuable role because it's at IIT Bombay, because it's within a wider, larger educational institution and one of our leading research and education institutions. And I hope this center will not try to be too independent. This center should build deep and permanent connections across campus and not try to do things on its own. Indeed, I would even connect the funding to working with other departments across campus. Yes, one should work on promoting MTechs and PhDs, but BTechs are at the heart of the quality human capital in the IIT system, and we must bring them in as much as we can to our center too, and give them an understanding of policy issues. And it's very good to hear just now that you're considering a proposal for a joint degree between the BTech and policy studies, a master's in policy studies. That kind of combination is very powerful because if we can create some good human capital for the country of people who have a solid technical understanding and combine it with policy studies, then you've got a very powerful combination. My last subject is to give you some examples of important public policy subjects. And the current public policy subjects, some of them I've been involved with in some degree, some I've been an observer of. I think all of them are very important. I'll give you 4 examples. Let me give you one which I was involved in when it happened, which was GST, the Goods and Services Tax. Now, as you know, we passed the GST on the basis of a certain system. We tried to take existing taxes and fit it in to a new regime, a new, better tax regime for goods and services. We did that to make it possible to happen, to get states behind it, and to get, including the government behind it, who were very concerned about potential revenue loss if we went for a more comprehensive system. We made theoretical compromises with what we knew was the right and best thing to do, but we did it because this was possible to get done. And I'm in favor of that kind of approach because GST was actually progress for the country. It took us forward from where we were earlier in the kind of tax system that we had. Having done that, we now need to keep improving it. And we now need to keep coming back to what was that better solution that we can actually bring about. How can we actually bring about greater simplicity? How can we go from having to file in 29 different places in the country to just filing in one place? How can we remove exemptions? How can we increase coverage of the GST system? Let me give you another example, a very favorite example of mine. One of the areas that I've tried to do some work in is in the area of innovation policy. And one of the components of innovation policy is tax incentives for R&D and for investment in R&D within firms. We had a policy in place where we had a 200% weighted deduction that companies got for their in-house R&D spending. And a few years ago, there was this discussion in the finance ministry about what the right approach was going forward. That should we have a tax regime, we had much higher rates of tax then, should we have a much higher tax regime, or should we have fewer exemptions and try to go for fewer taxes and lower taxes and fewer exemptions, much fewer exemptions or no exemptions? And we had recommended that we go for no exemptions and an 18% corporate tax, because that's what the actual net collection rate was of corporate taxes and continues to be even today in the country, right? So you said go for something that's simpler. We went partway in that direction 2 years ago, and it was progress for the country. In the process, the R&D tax exemption has also, over these last few years, gone away. Now, it's my favorite exemption. It's my favorite incentive. I believe it's for something that's very valuable. But you make those compromises in the interest of moving forward in a desired policy direction of simpler, lower taxes, which is what overall seems to be more economically effective. Let me give you a third example, which is climate change. Climate change is the big issue of our times. It's going to be the big issue of our times for the next 50 years. And in fact, it'll be great news if it stops being the big issue of our times. As a country, we are one of the countries that will be the hardest hit by climate change. So it's in our interest to actually see that there is as much global progress for climate change as there possibly can be. One of the key components in climate change to mitigate carbon emissions and to mitigate global warming is to restrict carbon emissions. That requires a shift to using electricity as a source of distributed energy, both for mobility and for industry and industrial applications. But it doesn't help to shift to electricity if we keep generating most of our electricity from coal-fired power plants. because coal-fired power plants directly contribute to global warming and massive carbon emissions. Now, how fast should we actually bring about this shift from coal-fired power plants to cleaner sources of generating electricity? How should we bring about that shift? What is the role for carbon pricing in such a move? What is the role for taxes? And what is the role for environmental regulation in driving such a shift? These are all public policy questions. Let me give you a third example, which is very contemporary. That third example is the role of policy, public policy, and COVID, what we've all been going through over these last 18 months. Look at the tension that we've seen between scientific expertise and policy. Scientific expertise is essential, but at the end of the day, it's policy and policy professionals who need to take the call on how to balance safety with normality, how to balance basic health infrastructure and investment for that would cover everyone with more specialized care, which is more expensive and may benefit only a few. How to balance the question of state capacity with what you want to bring about. If we have limited state capacity, which was referred to earlier on, if we have limited state capacity, then how do we pick the simpler alternative and the simpler solution, whether it's a simpler solution in the pricing of vaccines or in the distribution of vaccines or getting NGOs involved or companies involved in that process? And indeed, how do we build trust? Trust in government, trust in policy, trust that we're making the right calls for the greater good of the people. All of these are important, vital policy questions. They make our life as a people better. That's why public policy matters. Our role in a place like the Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies is to come up with both theoretically sound and policy doable solutions. It's that both that policy studies is all about. It's theoretically sound and it's doable. Whether or not that sensible policy that we come up with happens or not will depend on those stars lining up that I spoke about earlier on. Those stars of having the right kind of minister in place, the right department secretary in place, and the right preparation and solution in place. And it's up to us as a Center for Policy Studies to produce those right solutions. So I look forward over these next years to really great output from the Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies that will both enrich our understanding of policy issues and take us forward as a country in the direction that we need to go. Thank you.
Members of the IIT Bombay community, Ashank Desai, Naushad Forbes, Shishir Jha, and others who are there. Let me begin by, first of all, congratulating both IIT for having the foresight of setting up a policy studies institute, and Ashank Desai for his generosity and farsightedness in helping establish this institute. As I was listening to Naushad just now, I was thinking, there goes my speech, because he was touching on so many things that touch a chord in me, and I wanted to talk about, but I will nevertheless, at the risk of some repetition, go into some of the same matters. I have believed for long that you need top quality technical research. IIT Bombay epitomizes that. And there are people who are actually implementing policies out there in the world. You also need that linkages. And if I may give examples from United States, some of the best universities doing some of the finest cutting edge technical research also have these policy centers which provide a critical linkage between the research going on in the institute and the academy and the policymakers who are out there sitting in Washington, D.C., implementing policies. So the Ashank Desai Center that is being set up, that has been set up, in fact, in the early days, I had interaction with Ashank and others when this was beginning to come up. And now that there is a formal launch, I think this is a great occasion. And I'm absolutely delighted that this is happening at a top place like IIT Bombay. This is happening. Let me jump in a little bit to the topic. I want to give you some illustrations of this dualism of the practical real world that we have to handle and research that we have to do. You know, very often for researchers, the motivation for research, whether it be in mathematics, in engineering, in economics, in physics, very often the motivation is you're not really thinking about solving a real world problem. For you, it is the passion of composing music or doing a painting. That's an end in itself. It's such an exciting venture. And you need the policy people to pay attention to this, which transforms some of these ideas into applications in the real world. And today, all over the world and in India, we face a very big challenge, a challenge that comes about from the last 15 years and actually more if you look deeper, of all kinds of policy problems, deadly policy problems that have been cropping up in the world. 2008, go back to 2008, there was the subprime crisis in the United States, which immediately spilled over into the Great Recession all over the world. 2011, debt, sovereign debt built up in the European nations in a way we couldn't imagine. We now understand why that happened. There was a construction flaw in the creation of the euro and the fiscal union. There was no fiscal union, the monetary union and the lack of fiscal union, which we later realized has sparked off a huge problem in Europe. The end of the commodity price cycle. Then generally what Naushad has already touched on, the deteriorating environment which we have faced for quite some time is causing migrants to move, is causing political conflict to crop up all over the world. And the last straw has been the COVID-19 pandemic. The world has been just troubled by all these, so much so that we are doing a lot of major stock taking now of where do we stand. It is in some sense for the world, and there is no getting away from that. This is an existential challenge, a bit like what the dinosaur had faced, and the dinosaur actually perished. But one big difference with the dinosaur and us human beings is that we are capable of self-analysis. We can say, let us pause and take stock of the way we are behaving and reform our own behavior because we do not want to meet the fate of the dinosaurs. And that is once again, that discourse of the change in our own behavior is what lies at the interface between the world of science and what we know and the world of practical policy making. And we are at one such critical juncture. Let me get into two sort of common wisdom that is coming out of the crisis that has gone on now, which I disagree with. One is there are people saying that there is going to be de-globalization, that we are all troubled by globalization and there is going to be de-globalization. And there is another group that is saying that our rapid growth is not compatible with the environment, so growth has to slow down. I actually don't agree with either of these. There is a risk of us stumbling into the dinosaur's fate, but if we manage to avoid that, I feel, first of all, growth can pick up and globalization can also continue and in fact will continue. Let me quickly touch on the growth and I want to put that aside. People make a mistake that when they think of GDP growth, they immediately assume that GDP is more cars, more homes, more luxury boats, and those things can be there. But as all economists know, GDP is anything that you value and consume. A haircut given by someone, a good haircut to you, is a slight rise in GDP. So if you buy greater health, if there is more research on health, our longevity goes up, our pain that we suffer, physical pain goes down, our mental capacities improve. That is all addition to GDP. And I'm not saying anything novel over here. This is well recognized. If we take in more music, more art, more philosophy, that consumption is also GDP. So we can have GDP growing in leaps and bounds, but the components of this GDP have to change from what they are now to something novel. And I think that's possible. That has happened in the past. And my belief is, just as before the Industrial Revolution and after the Industrial Revolution, after 100 years of a very risky period for the world, growth rate picked up massively. Actually, now the whole world grows 10 times the rate at which the world used to grow before the Industrial Revolution. And I feel that can happen once again. But let me come to globalization. People feel that, many people, the President Macron has talked about it, that there is going to be deglobalization. We will retreat from globalization. And there are reasons why we fear that, is that there is, with globalization, a risk of supply chain disruption, which can be massive. Let me give you a very simple example. In fact, with Naushad here, I feel awkward because I think first time I heard about this very small everyday example of supply chain links was from Naushad, but I have repeated it so many times that now I keep believing it's my story. Let me give that story to you. This is gum for pasting labels in medicine. I think I heard it first from Naushad, which is, when we had the lockdown, we did want to keep the pharmaceutical industry, medicines being produced, that sector should continue to function. But in a heavily linked up world, one tiny component can backfire and hold up the entire process. In this case, the little bit of gum that you need to stick the labels of medicines, that gum was not being produced by the lockdown. This was fortunately quickly recognized and it was corrected. But think of now the big, large world and the several linkages. If one country produces all the chips for the whole world, or take the automobile industry, if one country becomes very good at producing all the gearboxes for all the cars, you will have more efficient cars. But if that country runs into trouble, the entire automobile industry in the world is going to come to a halt. And this also has a political side to it. In the event of political conflict, one country can deliberately threaten the world that we are going to stop this component on which the entire global industry is running, which will bring the whole global industry to a halt. This risk of globalization is real, and we have to face this challenge. People also talk about outsourcing. That outsourcing is going to be stalled because by outsourcing, the domestic labor in rich countries is losing out. I don't think that is going to happen for the following reason. Any country, say the United States, today says that we are not going to outsource. We are not going to use labor sitting in Bangalore or in Manila or in Cape Town or wherever in the world. We are not going to use that. We will use our own labor. See what is going to happen. The product that comes out of United States will be slightly higher priced because it's not making use of an input that is available. So Germany or China or any other country that uses this resource which is available, and today thanks to digital connection can be used, countries that use it will outcompete the countries that build walls and refuse to use this. So my hunch is outsourcing is going to pick up, and thanks to this last 1.5 years of learning by doing. Learning by doing is an old concept in economics, which had been written about by Kenneth Arrow of Stanford University, Nobel Prize winner, one of the greatest thinkers, that one way in which productivity goes up is first you have to have the technology, and then people have to learn to use it by learning by doing. Just imagine, think of the last 1.5 years, the training that we have had in the use of digital technology, all of us, is just huge. So my expectation is that outsourcing and all the activities that make use of these digital connections is going to go up. So we are entering a new world with new products coming into place, new technologies which are going to speed us up. So there are big challenges, and this is not the occasion to go into this. I just want to point out to the other side of this, and I'm going to stop. You see, it is quite interesting that the Industrial Revolution, say roughly from 1850 to, 1750 to 1850, the 100 years of the Industrial Revolution, coincided, first of all, with some of the most radical policy reforms, policies which now look to us completely commonplace. Children must not work more than 8 hours, one of the first regulations. Children as young as 8 years old, 10 years old, should not work more than 8 hours. When these laws were first brought in, people were shocked. Hard work by children builds character in the labor force. How can you stop children 8 years old from working 8 hours a day? It'll be detrimental to the country. Seems completely normal to us. The income tax was brought in 1842, and people were shocked. How can the government take away a part of the income that I have generated? Now it seems normal that the government does it. I think we are at a juncture where we need novel policies that we have to think about in order to take on the dinosaur risk that we face today. Number two, the 100 years of the Industrial Revolution were also the 100 years of the most dramatic changes in the way we think about the world in terms of economic theory. Just imagine the overlap. The Industrial Revolution starts 1740, 1750. Dramatic big work in 1776, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Soon after that, David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx, and later on, Leon Walras, Stanley Jevons, the top-notch mathematical economists have come into play. It's a rough 100 years period when some of the most dramatic breakthroughs in economics, our understanding of the world goes up, and we are able to make better policies because that understanding has gone up. One analogy from mathematics which fascinates me is, in all disciplines, there are underlying assumptions so hidden that we, the practitioners, are also not aware of those assumptions. Big breakthroughs are the sudden awareness that we are making use of an assumption which has gone outdated. We are entering a new world where we have to recognize that some assumptions that we made in the past, those assumptions do not hold. Economics is full of them. Our social and political assumptions about trust, how we relate to one another, we economists don't write those down as axioms, but we make those assumptions and we have internalized that. It's time to think about it. One of the most dramatic global examples of that, Euclid created this beautiful geometry with the axioms written down. One axiom that Euclid was using, but Euclid was unaware of. Euclid's geometry was all being done on a flat plane, not on the sphere like the one we live on. When you traveled short distances, that geometry and the science that gave rise to were absolutely fine. You would not make any big mistakes. But as we began traveling the globe and planes were flying all over, if our belief was that we are on a flat surface and created a geometry on the flat surface, we would have made dramatic mistakes. Fortunately, non-Euclidean geometry was born because some people, and it is quite interesting that a lot of this you don't need top scientists. It's people with common sense looking at the world can realize that one assumption we are making about the world may not be true. And we know now today that among the early thinkers, Omar Khayyam, around the 12th century, had a sense that Euclid had used an assumption which Euclid was not aware of. Omar Khayyam didn't do much with it. The big breakthrough came in 1807. This is also not talked about enough. This was by Karl Schweikart, a lawyer, a practicing lawyer in Germany, who sensed that there was one assumption being used which would mess up the real world behavior. And Carl Schweikart wrote a paper in 1807. He later became a professor of mathematics. He gave up law and became a professor. And then the big mathematicians come in, Gauss, Riemann, etc., creating the new geometry, realizing that the world is different from what Euclid had assumed, and we need that. I believe we are at such a juncture in economics where you need, once again, profound breakthroughs in economic theory, for which we need a class of people technically trained going into that, but even people with common sense looking at the world and saying that, shaking us up and saying that you need to look at this. We also need radical policies that we like the ones we undertook during the Industrial Revolution, which helped us come out of the Industrial Revolution much better off. We are at such a juncture. And centers like the one that Bombay IIT, I'm stressing both because you need a top-notch, intellectually well-endowed place to have a center like this, plays a role in giving us some hope that we will meet this dinosaur risk and challenge well and come out of it winners in the end. Let me stop. Thank you very much.
Begin. Good evening, everyone. And I hope the technology works. This hybrid model is indeed a challenge, but I think in presenting us with this challenge, it also makes the case, as well as all of you, our erudite speakers, have made, of why it's so important. The world is in a moment of deep disruption, and why it's so important for us to build a space that seeks to unpack this disruption, understand its dynamics, and then look towards how we can find solutions to live with, leverage this disruption to make for a better world. So I think all that we have experienced of the hybrid model of this discussion really emphasizes why the center is so very valuable. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be part of this inauguration as the head of a policy research think tank that sits at the intersection of the university and the practice of policy. We've often lamented the absence of an ecosystem of academic institutions that we can work with, that we can leverage, that we can shed tears with and celebrate with in this very complex task of engaging with the policy ecosystem in India. So it's really exciting for us to have the opportunity to so early on be part of this new institution, and I hope that we can build new partnerships. Everyone has spoken of the importance of integrating the technology contributions of the IIT with the policy school itself and the building of new disciplines. I hope that you will also leverage the existing ecosystem of research institutions because we can only be able to influence change in India if we work collectively and together. So really looking forward to working with you going forward. I think I just want to say one more thing before I lead into questions. Both our speakers have really raised very important issues, both in terms of what it means to be what good policy is, what does it mean to build theoretical knowledge and doability into the discourse on policy, the big pressing questions and challenges of policy making that we face in a very disruptive world, the big push that we need to make of established disciplines to be more disruptive and innovative and genuinely ask questions that are reflective of the realities that we live in today. But underlying all of this is the need for strong and robust institutions that have the capability of being independent, that have the capability of being innovative, that have the capability to take risk to try and seek answers to these very complex questions. And it's in that spirit that I think setting up of this new institute is so very valuable. We have very few robust institutions that are both, I mean, the university in India itself is under its own forms of stress and innovation. Research institutions institutions, civil society institutions are all going through a moment of disruption. And the real underlying foundations of what it takes to build an ecosystem of robust, rigorous institutions that can credibly and independently contribute to knowledge building, knowledge creation, and interface in policy is so important. And in that spirit, this new institution is a really important contribution to the public life of India. And I'm really looking forward to future interactions and to the cohort of students that come from this. So my role in today's conversation is to really sort of push both our speakers on the many provocative and thoughtful comments they have made to engage more in trying to understand this interface between the world of academia, research, doing, and this rather awkward in between of the public policy professional. I often find that when I'm asked, what do you do? And I try to explain I'm a public policy practitioner and I bridge the gap between research and practice. I've lost my audience completely. But we do play an important role in public life, or so I'd like to think. And I'd like to push both of you to help us understand this a little bit, because everybody here is in some way either about to become a public policy professional or actively in the process of participating in the profession. But I think a profession needs to define itself in order for it to have the ability to express the values, the integrity of a profession, its norms in its day-to-day life. And I wanted to hear both of you on this subject. I know, Naushad, you have a hard stop. So I'm going to start with you before I come to Kaushik. And let me ask you a very specific question. You spoke about, you made two very important interventions. You said there is a set of the sort of universe has to align with itself in a particular way for policy reform to take place. You need to have the right minister, the right secretary, you need to have the technical knowledge. All three need to come together. What are the conditions under which all these three have to come together? And where in that context is there a role for the public policy practitioner? And linked to that, you said that good public policy practice is policy that bridges theory and doability. Do these two really align always? Because there are times when the theory might take you very, very far away from doability. And in that context, what is the role of the public policy practitioner and how does she move the ecosystem towards this constellation that you say has to line up in order for real change to happen? So just from your experiences, it'll be really helpful for us to hear from you.
Sure. Thank you, Yamini, for those comments. But thank you especially, Kaushik, for as always inspiring us all with your thoughts and your perspective. It's always an inspiration and pleasure to hear you. On your first question, I think unfortunately those three stars lining up of the right minister, the right department secretary, and the right preparation. I unfortunately think it's a largely random process. My argument is that the preparation should always be in place. The depth of the work, the understanding, what needs to be done should always be in place. So that then when you have the right combination of minister and bureaucrat, the department secretary, you can make things happen. So as an institute, we should have, if we're working in the area of energy policy, mobility policy, anything, we should have the right preparation in place, the right policy briefs in place, the right work done, the right options laid out. And then you have the right minister, you have the right department secretary, you go to them and you say, listen, here's what we think, and you try to engage with them and try and get that to happen. So, I'm making the argument that we need to be prepared from the policy field at all times with the right solutions and the right thinking in place. And then when those stars line up, that's not within our control, but we should be prepared at any point in time. It's quite a humble proposal that I'm making, actually. But I think it's potentially powerful. Your second question, Yamini, just
So on the relationship between theory and
yes,
doability.
on theory and doability. You know, the reason I say that is because, well, Kaushik is one of our greatest economists, right? Um, Let me give you, I don't know if he'll talk about it, but if he doesn't, I encourage him to talk about it. When he was our chief economic advisor, um, he actually he gave a very, very thoughtful speech on corruption and actually suggested a way of moving forward as a where we could move very substantially forward as a country if we thought about corruption in a different way. Um, it was an idea that was politically, no politician wanted to be, I think, seen even thinking of how you could move forward on the corruption side beyond ban it, right? And where did that get us? It got us a lot of corruption. And I think Kaushik was proposing a way in which we could get to a situation where we would end up with less corruption and we would use economic incentives actually as a tool for reducing corruption by incentivizing the right behavior. Um, it's the kind of thing which can take us forward as a country. It's the kind of very pragmatic. It's doable, but you need someone who's willing and has the courage to run and do it. Yeah, and that then needs an imaginative minister who has that courage to say, yes, this makes sense. Let's see what we can do. Let me give you another example. The GST point. You know, industry keeps asking for lower rate of GST, lower rate of GST, and I think it's wrong. We should not ask for exemptions and we should not ask for lower rates. We should ask for a uniform lower rate. That's the right approach, right? So we should not be saying, move these goods from 18% or 12% to 5%. Exempt these goods. That's a mistake, right? What should we seek? We should seek something that is more modest, a lower rate overall, with no exemptions. Now that's the right policy prescription. It's theoretically the right thing to do. To give you an example, if we had this is Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah have pointed out that if we had a 10% rate of GST, which covered 70% of the economy, meaning leave out basic foodstuffs and agriculture, but it covered 70% of the economy. So not complete coverage, the 15% that's agriculture plus another 15% for other things. We would have 7% of GDP as our GST collections. Our actual GST collections, our budgeted GST collections, which we don't achieve, is 4%. So theoretically, we could achieve a lot better revenue collections with a lot simpler, more powerful system. That's what theory must keep pushing. It must keep pointing out that we can do a lot better. And then the doable part is convincing people that this is right for them, that this is right for people in industry, this is right for consumers, this is right for the country all around. So, you have to keep bringing those two together. You can't simply say, this is the right thing to do. I'm a purist. I will give you, that's just fine. That's what a technical person should do. They should say, this is the understanding, this is the pure prescription. I think a person in policy cannot be so pure. A policy person has to say, what's the right thing that we can do now without losing sight of where we must eventually go. The famous perfect is the enemy of the good saying, right? So you start with the good now. So you move forward as a country, you move forward in policy terms, you move forward in reform, and then you come back to perfection later on. You keep moving towards it.
Thank you, Naushad. Kaushik, I think Naushad makes a very important case, I think, for also recognizing what I interpreted from what he's saying about the role of ideas, the role of practice and doability. Interlaced in all of this is the role of politics. And both, what is it that creates that ecosystem for the stars to line up for the technical solutions to find their way into change, and what it takes to actually make the kinds of compromises that you need to make in order to go from the theory to the doability and start moving the envelope. Politics sits very firmly in the center of all of this. Yet often as technocrats, technical experts engaging in public policy, we tend to see politics as a problem, and we tend to disengage from politics. So could you speak a little bit about the intersections of politics and policy, and how should we as academics and researchers becoming policy practitioners interpret and understand this interplay?
Thank you, Yamini. The question you asked actually was pretty much at the heart of my own experience coming into the policy making world from pure academe. And I would, initially, it is the new world that was a shock to me, but later on, occasionally, when I would get people from pure academe to come and give us some advice, to sit with some of the ministers and talk, occasionally it would strike me that the academic or the researcher who's coming in is showing so little sensitivity to politics that at one level those good ideas are doomed to start with. Because for any idea to be put into implementation, you have to be aware that politics is going to play a role. At times, actually, politics plays a good role because it restrains the political leader from certain actions. So the larger awareness of the world that everyone is watching restrains certain kinds of behavior. But the interface between politics and, in my case, the academic discipline of economics is crucial. You know, Albert Hirschman used to talk about the importance of trespassing disciplines, that you have to trespass from one to the other to do it better. And really coming into the world of policy is what made me acutely aware of this. And since Naushad gave the example of that corruption control measure that I had suggested, which ran into a lot of difficulty, for me, that was no surprise because I was aware that the measure sounds awful. And there it was hitting a roadblock of politics, because if it does not sound nice, high-handed morally, for politicians, it's very difficult to push that through because they are aware of the reaction that is going to take place. But later on, I became aware of many little policies where the interface with politics is just so important that if you don't do this, the policy is going to be doomed to start with. I'll give you one more example, which for me is one of my favorites, is the use of auctions in selling things that the government is selling. A lot of advanced economies use it have been using it for a long time. Whereas in economics, in developing countries like India, the government will sit, bureaucrats will value it, and then you hand it over to an industrialist. Very often, you've undersold it with a huge gap, which is just handed over. If you do a well-designed auction, you can do much better on that. And actually, India learned that during the Spectrum auction. But the auction is also a very, very political animal when you're doing this, when you're selling this. So a part of the design of the auction is the awareness of the political framework within which your policy is being implemented, how you can do it. And there I have to say, politicians, seasoned bureaucrats play a very important role. And that's why I feel in a government, you do need those bureaucrats who have a sense of the politics, having been in the game for a long time, and from the world of research where you're bringing pure ideas into this interface, and it backfires because of the lack of either of them.
So the study of political economy is perhaps as important to public policy as a study of the economy. would you say that? Because I only ask this because often when we think about our curriculums in public policy schools, we tend to again move in the direction of a very technocratic set of silos. And I think one of the important questions that a new institute needs to grapple with is precisely this question of what should my curriculum be, and how does one take the real world experiences of policymaking into an academic understanding of what makes for good policy.
So absolutely, economics for a long time used to be referred to as political economy.
Yes.
It's only around the sort of 1880s, with the technical work coming in, it becomes economics as something pure. But earlier, all the discussion with John Stuart Mill and others was of political economy, and I think that's crucial. I do believe, though, that when it comes to research, at times, you have to cut up this very big space and do these little bits of work, granular work, very, very carefully, often using a lot of mathematical techniques. Auction, again, is a very good example. I mean, if I had a longer time, I would give you some dramatic examples of a well-designed auction and a badly designed auction. This is technical work. But then you have to, once you've done that, you have to push that back into the political economy world in carrying it out into the world of policy. And once again, since we are having this discussion in the on the occasion of the founding of this policy center, that is exactly what the policy center should do. Put the politics back into reality and then try to devise the ideas that have been generated.
Naushad, since you have a hard stop, I just wanted you to very quickly before you go reflect for us on the relationship between the role of business and the role of public policy research. I say this because very often, I mean, I would, even if I talk about my own institution, we think of public policy as very much a relationship between academia and policymakers. At most, the public in a very broad way is taken as a stakeholder, but we don't often actively look at the market and business stakeholders as critical players and individuals to engage with in the process of shaping policy, shaping an ecosystem for policy. So just wanted your reflections on that too, before you go.
Well, I think business plays a big role in the policy space, both as individual companies and through institutions. I've been involved with the Confederation of Indian Industry for many, many years. And CI has been very actively involved in the policy space as well. And, people would often talk about industry associations as policy advocacy bodies. I think that doesn't do justice to what CI actually does, because CI would actually work with a government department to help actually come up with what the policy should be. So it's not saying this is what the policy is, but what should the policy be? Doing the actual groundwork to come up with the right approaches in policy. And that's one of the areas, by the way, where I used to always say that in CI, we should be really prepared at any point in time with everything that should be done in a particular area, with everything worked out with data and so on. So that then if you have those right stars that get lined up, you're ready to go. What is the individual company role? My view is that government and policymakers should hear industry and industrialists, but it shouldn't listen to industry and industrialists. You need independence. Companies are well within their rights to keep advocating and arguing for what will be in their interest. But that doesn't mean that policy should respond to it and listen to them and go ahead with a policy that benefits a particular company. I think policy has to, at all times, really worry about the national interest to a much greater extent and act in a manner that's consistent with that national interest. So what's the role of industry? We should keep coming up with our own arguments of what would make sense, maybe for individual companies, maybe for a particular industrial sector. More independent institutions like CII should keep arguing more broadly of what's in the national interest. But at the end of the day, the policymaker has to say, this is what's in the national interest, balancing everything out. I don't think the national interest is served by listening to any one constituency and saying, that's what we'll do.
Absolutely. Thank you. Kaushik, my last question to you. Naushad spoke, I think, made a very important point about the role of trust. Trust between the expert and the policymaker, trust between the policymaker and citizens, trust between citizens and the expert, all of which have been put to some degree of stress over this COVID period. Can you speak to what it will take to rebuild that trust, to rebuild credibility in and integrity of both of the policymaker, but also of the policy practitioner, the credibility of integrity and independence. These are values that we must take with us as budding practitioners, as existing practitioners, as teachers and scholars of public policy. So just your reflections on this.
Yeah. Yamini, I just to stress right away, I feel trust is one of those qualities underlying an economy, which makes a huge difference to how well an economy functions, because every transaction cannot be backed up by a written contract. We are doing deals continuously. A society where there is an underlying bedrock of trust begins to flourish because that trust actually helps in transactions being done. So it's very, very important. How do you nurture this? Well, I frankly do not know where it comes from, but I know that there are some societies have got it more, some have got it less. One thing I do not think is this is at all anything that is genetically hardwired. That you will be a less trusting society is hardwired, not at all. It's to do with our history, our leadership, that this matters. The most important group in this is frankly the leadership. If the leadership realizes that at the top, yes, you have to be politically correct, careful with languages, all that is true. But honesty at the top somehow inspires people. When you can see that occasionally there are hard things that the leadership says. I actually did appreciate just now when Naushad was stressing, as a person from industry, that there is a bigger, larger national interest. And that is what has to be kept in mind. If every time in a subtle way you're promoting your own interest, your political ends, the next election, or even your profit and the tax cut that you need for your sector, you are beginning to damage that larger fabric of trust in society. So I can't quite tell you where exactly this comes from. But there is a lot of writing from Francis Fukuyama to others showing that societies that have developed trust begin to flourish and do better. And societies where trust begins to erode, it does worse. And yes, everyone has a role, but I think the political leadership here has a very, very big role in bringing society together, in people feeling that we are part of a whole and we have to add collectively. So I know it's an incomplete answer, but it's such a difficult question that I would just urge that we think about it, and we do not as yet have an exact answer.
Thank you. Perhaps we as public policy professionals should also constantly remember the complexity of or the importance of trust and ensure that we play our role in speaking to truth to power and maintaining our independence as researchers and public policy practitioners and holding national interest at the center of it all. Thank you very much, Kaushik Basu and Naushad Forbes, for such an enlightening conversation. And back to the organizers to close the session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sirs. May I now request Professor Joshi to come up on the dais and deliver the vote of thanks as a closing remark for the evening.
Good evening to all of you. All good things come to an end at some point of time. So is this program also will have to come to an end. But before that, it's my pleasant duty to thank all of you. There are a large number of audiences, people who joined us online and were watching the program. So thanks to all of them for joining the program. Most importantly, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to Ashank for generous contribution and his family for supporting the institute. I'm sure that Ashank's contribution will go a long way in strengthening this Center for Policy Studies, and it will be a leader in the country. Our sincere thanks go to Professor Kaushik Basu, who has agreed to be the guest speaker on this occasion. Just because it is named with Ashank. He said, I'm so busy, but Ashank is such a nice person. I will spare time for him. Thanks to Dr. Naushad Forbes. He has also immediately agreed to be the speaker at this occasion. Our thanks to Yamini goes to Yamini, who has actually conducted this program very well, asked relevant questions, and making it interesting to all of us. Our thanks to Professor Deepak Phatak. He has been a guru, mentor to all of us, and he has joined this program to bless us the launch of this Ashank Desai Center for Policy Studies. It is probably that he smells whenever some good things happen in IIT, and that draws him into the institute. Thank you, Professor Phatak, for your affection to the institute. Thanks to Professor Agnihotri, who has been the first head of the policy studies and has laid foundation for this center. Professor Shishir Jha, who has given the complete overview of the center, and he has been associated with us during the entire process of naming and launch and organizing this event. Professor Jha has enormous responsibility on his shoulder to steer this center ahead. We wish you all the best for the future journey. Thanks to CDEEP team for making these efforts of marrying the two different versions of the program, one online physical and other one also online, live program. Our thanks to our team, Dipti and Prachi and Nidhi, who have been tirelessly working along with Ravi Shankar, tirelessly working for the event. And Ashank knows how much efforts have gone in designing the logo and designing the tagline for this. We can write one small story on that also. So thank you very much for everyone for participating in this event, participating and contributing to the launch of this new initiative of IIT Bombay. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Joshi. May I now request you to present the memento to Mr. Desai. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed the event. Take care and stay safe.